Russia's engineering feats have dazzled the world. One was as much a miracle as a tribute to human toil: the Trans-Siberian Railroad. It was the most expensive, difficult, and longest railroad ever constructed, running 6,000 miles across Asia to the Pacific, and every mile was built by hand. Moscow, Russia's capital and the seat of the former Soviet Union, is the hub of one of the largest railroad networks in the world. There are 9 railway stations in Moscow that route 1 million passengers a day to and from Europe and Asia. In this vast land, trains carry more passengers than any other means of transportation. Yaroslavsky Station, built under Joseph Stalin, is the western terminus for the most famous train in the country, the Trans-Siberian Railway. It makes 45 stops over an 8-day trip that runs 6,183 miles over, across, and through a continent synonymous with frigid temperatures and impassable terrain. Along the way, it is everything a train can be: a school bus, a taxi, a job. Most of all, it is an essential link to villages like Litsvyanka on the fringe of civilization in the heart of Central Asia. To the people who depend on this train, there is nothing extraordinary about the sight of tracks and tunnels carved through the sheer granite cliffs that rise 1,500 feet above Lake Baikal, where ice lingers till May and temperatures drop to -40 in February. The railroad has been here since 1905. No one remembers life without it. Like a heartbeat, it is quietly taken for granted. Yet a century ago, it was virtually unthinkable that a train would unite Europe and Asia. Here, the terrain and climate are treacherous, the job was enormous, and the costs were staggering. The modern-day equivalent of $50 billion, nearly twice that of landing a man on the moon, to build a railroad through a land just as desolate. In spite of the obstacles, by the end of the 19th century, it was a national imperative to build it.
It sometimes took years for messages and edicts and plans to reach the farthest edges of their empire. Without lines of communication, without an effective internal telegraph system, without a railroad system, Russia was at a serious disadvantage.
The country occupies the largest area on Earth. It stretches from St. Petersburg to the Pacific. It is wider than the breadth of the United States and Canada combined, but only wagon trails had linked it to the capital. Russia needed a railroad to command and control its vast Asian territories. There were constant reports that China planned to overrun Siberia's undefended border. Warships from Japan menaced the Russian coast. Even more troubling were Siberian revolutionaries who demonstrated their desire of breaking away from the capital. By the reign of Alexander III, Russia was adrift in crisis.
Tsar Alexander III came into power when his father was assassinated in 1881. His entire reign was dedicated to the idea of Russia for the Russians, of establishing firmer governmental control over a country that seemed to be slipping out of control. The railroad was the answer to all of this. It was partly military defense, but it was also internal police measures.
Alexander III was determined to build a railroad to move soldiers to and from the hinterland. But he also intended to use it to colonize Siberia. Just as the American Transcontinental Railroad had tamed the West, Russia would tame the East. There was nothing but scattered forts and trading posts. Few people lived here except convicts in exile and Stone Age tribes. The Tsar wanted the same success as America's Transcontinental Railroad, but had none of the economic foundation.
One of the most profound disadvantages that Russia faced in this project was a lack of entrepreneurial tradition. This was not a challenge of technology. They didn't have to invent anything new. It was a challenge of financing and organization.
Russia was a feudal society. Its railroad building experience was limited to a few hundred miles of track with antiquated trains.
It's one thing to project a railroad of 500 or even 1,000 miles. It's quite another to project a railroad that would consume unimaginable quantities of timber, require hundreds of bridges, thousands of miles of rail, millions of tons of iron for spikes and bolts. Even running a few trains daily on a line 6,000 miles long is going to require thousands of cars, hundreds of locomotives, and training a workforce in a country that didn't have a great reservoir of mechanical talent.
No railroad in Russia or the world is as long or as complicated as the one called for in the Trans-Siberian. It had to cross 3 of the world's largest rivers, the world's largest forest, the world's largest lake, in the world's worst climate. Much of the railway was built on permafrost. It is rock solid most of the year, but melts into craters under the stress. They must also tunnel through a mountain chain. Overall, there are countless bridges over ravines and rivers.
The Trans-Siberian Railroad was simply one of the most grandiose enterprises of the 19th century, maybe of all of modern history, more costly than any other peaceful undertaking in the history of the modern world.
Alexander entrusted the Committee of Communication with the task of planning the railroad. But the committee was stymied. They advised the Tsar against it.
They didn't see that the government could afford to build this railroad, and they were right. There wasn't a labor force of an adequate size in isolated Siberia. There weren't steel mills in Siberia to supply the railroad. There weren't supplies of coal.
Impossible or not, the Tsar was determined to have a railroad. When the committee told him it couldn't be built, he dissolved the committee, then entrusted Sergei Witte, the builder of the 600-mile Odessa line, to build the 6,000-mile Trans-Siberian. But the Tsar was naive to think a royal temper could assure success.
A railroad is much more than trains and track. It's not a thing. It's nothing that a Tsar can call into being and then expect to work like some machine that you throw a switch and it goes forward. It's a complex interaction of human beings and parts and pieces extending over thousands of miles.
The longest railroad in the world today and the biggest project of the 19th century began in a cloud of bureaucratic fear. While planners searched for a miracle to build it, the Tsar boasted it was Russia's road to power, the start of a new era of peace and prosperity. The fact was, it would provoke a war and nearly bankrupt the country. As the century ended, many wondered if the railroad was worth its enormous expense, nearly 2/3 the state budget, or if it was just a desperate gamble of a dynasty in its waning days to